So picture this. You've done everything right. You've got a little savings account sitting there, maybe 3 months of expenses, maybe even 6. And every time you log in and see that number, you feel okay. Like genuinely okay. You feel like you've got a cushion under you, a little financial parachute that means life can throw something at you and you'll survive it. And then it does. Life throws something at you. Maybe it's a car repair that turns into a transmission replacement that somehow turns into a $4,200 bill that nobody warned you about. Maybe you lose your job in an industry that's changing faster than anyone predicted. Maybe it's a medical thing, not catastrophic, just annoying and expensive. And you dip into that fund, and you watch that number shrink. And somewhere around the middle of it, you realize this isn't going to be enough. You thought you were prepared, but you're not quite as prepared as you believed. That moment, that sinking, stomach-dropping moment where your safety net starts to feel more like a suggestion, that's exactly what I want to talk about today. My name is Emmy, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, financial psychology, and why people who seem to be doing everything right still end up blindsided by their financial lives. I think about the gap between what we're told to do and what actually works, and I think about how the rules that used to protect us are quietly shifting under our feet while we're busy just trying to keep up. Because here's the thing nobody is really saying out loud. The emergency fund advice you've been following, it was built for a different economy, a calmer one where a job loss lasted a few weeks, where inflation was a footnote in news articles, where the cost of a single medical visit didn't require a payment plan. That economy is gone, and if your emergency fund strategy hasn't caught up with where things actually are in 2026, you might be sitting on a number that feels reassuring but could leave you genuinely exposed. By the end of this video, I want you to have a completely different understanding of what a real emergency fund looks like right now. Not in 1995, not in 2012, but right now. I want you to know exactly why the old advice is failing people, and I want to give you a smarter, more honest framework for protecting yourself in an economy that has genuinely changed. Let's get into it. The 3 to 6 month rule was never as solid as it seemed. Okay, so we all know the rule. Save 3 to 6 months of living expenses in an accessible account. That's the advice. That's been the advice for decades. And honestly, when it was first popularized, it wasn't bad. It was based on a reasonable assumption about how long it takes the average person to recover from the average emergency: a job loss, an unexpected bill, a short period of instability. But here's what people don't talk about. The 3 to 6 months range is massive. 3 months and 6 months aren't even remotely the same thing in terms of protection. One of those is a suggestion, the other is an actual cushion. And the way most people interpret that rule, they aim for the low end of it. They hit 3 months, feel done, and mentally check that box. Which, look, I get it. Saving money is hard. Hitting any milestone feels like permission to stop. But 3 months was never designed for the modern job market. The assumption behind it was that if you lost your job, you'd find another one within that window. That's optimistic in a way that feels almost vintage at this point. Average job search timelines have stretched significantly. Depending on your industry, your salary range, your location, a job search in 2026 can easily run 4, 6, 8 months. And that's if you're actively searching in a market that's being disrupted by automation or corporate restructuring. A friend of mine, genuinely talented, good at her job, had her stuff together, was laid off from a mid-level marketing role last year. She had 4 months saved. She thought that was plenty. It took her 7 months to land something comparable. By month 5, she was taking freelance work she didn't want, pulling from retirement savings she couldn't afford to touch, and starting to negotiate with herself about what kind of job she'd accept. That's not a failure of character. That's a failure of the number. The 3 to 6 month rule was built in a world where job markets were more stable and more forgiving. That world has been replaced by something faster, more volatile, and less predictable. If you're still anchoring your emergency fund math to that old framework, you're essentially planning for a storm that doesn't look like the storms we're actually getting. What does this mean practically? It means the floor has shifted. For most people, 4 to 5 months should be the absolute minimum, and if you work in a volatile industry, if you're self-employed, if you're in a specialized field with fewer job openings, or if you're over a certain age where hiring discrimination is real, you probably need closer to 8 to 12 months. I know that sounds like a lot. Stick with me because I'll explain how to actually build towards that without feeling overwhelmed.
Inflation didn't just raise prices, it changed what an emergency costs. This one is subtle, but it's so important. Inflation does something that I don't think gets talked about enough in personal finance. It doesn't just raise the price of your grocery bill, it raises the price of your emergencies too. Think about what actually drains an emergency fund. Car repairs, medical bills, home repairs, the cost of being temporarily unemployed, rent, food, utilities, insurance. Every single one of those categories has gotten dramatically more expensive over the last few years. A car repair that would have cost you $800 in 2019 might run you $1,400 today. A 3-day hospital stay that used to hit your deductible hard might now blow straight past it and into out-of-pocket territory. So here's the math problem nobody does. If you saved your emergency fund 2 or 3 years ago and haven't really thought about it since, your fund has almost certainly lost purchasing power even if the number hasn't changed. You might have $15,000 sitting in your account, the same $15,000 you were proud of building, but that $15,000 covers fewer actual emergencies than it did when you saved it. The number looks the same, the protection is smaller. This is one of those things that kind of sneaks up on you, because when we think about whether our emergency fund is enough, we think about the number. We don't think about what that number actually buys in today's world. But that's the calculation that matters. The action here is uncomfortable but necessary. You need to recalculate your emergency fund target based on current prices, not the prices from whenever you originally set that goal. Pull up your actual monthly expenses, not a guess, not a round number, your real number, and make sure your target is based on what your life actually costs right now. For a lot of people, when they do this exercise honestly, they realize their 6 months fund is actually closer to 4 months of real protection. The hidden costs that blow up emergency funds and that nobody budgets for. Okay, this is where it gets a little uncomfortable because most people build their emergency fund around their known monthly expenses, rent, utilities, groceries, subscriptions. And that makes sense as a starting point. But real emergencies don't only pull from your regular budget. They create costs that are completely outside your normal financial life. Let me give you an example. You lose your job. On paper, your emergency fund covers your monthly expenses, but here's what also happens. You lose your employer-sponsored health insurance. Suddenly, you're paying for COBRA coverage or a marketplace plan, which can cost anywhere from $400 to $1,200 for a single person, more for families. Nobody budgets that into their emergency fund. Almost everyone is shocked by it when it actually happens. Or you have a major home repair. Let's say your HVAC system fails. The repair or replacement can run anywhere from $3,000 to $12,000 depending on your situation. But while you're dealing with that, you might also be dealing with temporary accommodations if it happens in July, or the ancillary costs of contractors coming and out, or the follow-on repairs that always seem to appear when you open up one problem. Emergencies compound. They come with friends. There's also the emotional spending that happens during emergencies, and I say this gently because it's real and it's human. When you're stressed, when your life feels out of control, you spend differently. You take the easier option, you order delivery more, and you make decisions that are about comfort rather than optimization. That's not weakness, that's being a person under pressure, but it means your emergency fund burns faster than your spreadsheet predicted. The practical takeaway here is that when you're calculating your emergency fund, you should add a buffer on top of your regular monthly expenses. Not a huge one, but something. Think about the costs that appear when life breaks down: temporary insurance costs, the expense of job searching itself, travel costs, the random stuff. A good rule of thumb is to add 15 to 20% on top of your regular monthly number, specifically to account for emergency-adjacent expenses. It feels like over-planning until you actually need it. Your job is less stable than you think it is. Yes, yours. I want to be careful here because I don't want to be alarmist, but I also want to be honest because I think a lot of people are operating on an assumption about their own job security that's genuinely outdated. There's been this quiet but significant shift happening in the labor market. Industries that used to feel stable, finance, tech, media, even parts of healthcare and law, have been running large-scale layoffs. Not just scrappy startups cutting fat, but major established companies doing rounds of cuts that affect mid-career professionals who've been there for years, who have strong performance reviews, who did everything right. It's happening at scale. And then there's the automation piece, which I know gets discussed to the point of feeling like background noise, but it's real and it's accelerating. A lot of the tasks that make up the middle layer of knowledge work, research, summarization, basic writing, data processing, certain kinds of analysis, are being handled by AI tools in ways that weren't possible even 2 years ago. That doesn't mean your job is disappearing tomorrow, but it does mean that the skill set that made you valuable in 2022 might need to look different in 2026, and transitions take time and create uncertainty. I'm not saying any of this to be scary. I'm saying it because emergency funds are fundamentally about risk, and if you're underestimating your personal employment risk, you're probably undersizing your fund. The question isn't just, what are my monthly expenses? It's, given my specific industry, my specific role, my specific situation, how long would it realistically take me to replace my income if I had to? That number is the one your fund should be protecting. If you're in a field that's being significantly disrupted right now, and you probably know if you are, that's a strong argument for pushing towards the higher end of your emergency fund target. Not because you're going to need it, but because having it means that if you do, you have options rather than panic. Where you're keeping your emergency fund might actually be costing you. All right, let's shift gears slightly because this is a piece of the conversation that doesn't get enough attention. We talk a lot about how much to save. We almost never talk about where to keep it and what that decision actually costs or protects you over time. For a long time, the advice was simple. Keep your emergency fund in a basic savings account. Accessible, safe, boring. And look, the accessible and safe parts are still right. Your emergency fund needs to be liquid. You need to be able to get to it quickly without penalties or market timing concerns. That's non-negotiable. But basic savings account used to mean something like 0.01% interest, which is essentially zero. If you're still keeping your emergency fund in an account like that, you're losing ground to inflation every month. The money is safe, but it's silently shrinking in real terms. The good news is that high-yield savings accounts have made this much less of an issue in recent years. Rates on these accounts have been meaningfully higher than traditional savings accounts, and keeping your emergency fund in one of these, still fully liquid, still FDIC insured, still boring and accessible, means you're at least partially keeping pace rather than actively falling behind. The move here is simple but worth doing. If your emergency fund is sitting in a basic checking or savings account earning next to nothing, move it to a high-yield savings account. It takes maybe an hour to set up and costs you nothing. It's one of those genuinely low-effort, high-value financial moves that a surprising number of people just haven't gotten around to. One thing I want to mention, and I'll just say this briefly because it matters, don't get tempted to chase yield in ways that compromise the core function of this money. I've seen people talk about keeping emergency funds in CDs with lockup periods or splitting it into brokerage accounts for better returns, and I understand the impulse, but your emergency fund has one job: be there when you need it, fast, no questions asked. Don't optimize it in ways that compromise that. The slightly better return isn't worth the friction when you actually need the money at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday.
I want to spend a little time on this specifically because if you're self-employed, freelance, or doing any kind of gig work, the conventional emergency fund math doesn't apply to you, and the gap between standard advice and what you actually need is really significant. When you work for a company, your income has a kind of baseline predictability. You know roughly what's coming in. An emergency is something on top of your normal life that disrupts it. But when you're self-employed, income variability is already built into your normal life. A bad month isn't necessarily an emergency. It might just be a slow month. which means your emergency fund has to do double duty. It has to cover actual emergencies and it has to buffer your income volatility. The standard advice, 3 to 6 months, was calibrated for the employed person. For self-employed people and freelancers, the number needs to be bigger. A lot of financial advisors working with self-employed clients suggest a floor of 9 to 12 months. Some suggest even more, depending on how lumpy your income is, how many clients you have, and how quickly you could rebuild your book of business if something disrupted it. There's also the taxes piece, which technically isn't part of your emergency fund, but functionally acts like one. Self-employed people need to set aside money for quarterly taxes, and if that discipline breaks down, which it does, especially in slow periods, it creates a tax liability that feels exactly like an emergency, even though it was technically predictable. Getting clear about separating your tax reserve from your emergency fund is important, and a lot of people blur those two things together in ways that leave them underprepared on both fronts. Building toward a bigger number without losing your mind. Okay, so at this point, if you're doing the math and realizing your emergency fund target needs to be larger than what you currently have, I want to acknowledge something. That can feel really demoralizing, like the goal just moved further away, and I don't want that to be the takeaway from this conversation. The takeaway I want you to have is that knowing the real target is better than feeling falsely secure with the wrong one. Even if you're not there yet, you can be making progress toward it, and progress toward the right goal, even slow progress, is infinitely better than feeling done when you're not actually protected. Here's a practical framework for thinking about building toward a larger fund without feeling like it's impossible. First, get clear on your actual target, not a vague more than I have, a specific number based on your real monthly expenses, your personal employment risk, and the inflation-adjusted costs of your likely emergencies. Write it down. Give it a name if that helps. Second, don't try to fund it all at once. Automate a fixed amount every month, even if it's modest, directly into your high-yield savings account before you ever touch your paycheck. Automating removes the willpower requirement from the equation, which is where most savings goals die. Third, set a milestone rather than obsessing over the end number. If you need $30,000 and you have $8,000, your next milestone is $12,000, not $30,000. Progress is motivating when you can see it. And fourth, this one's quieter but important. Review it annually. Your emergency fund target isn't a number you set once and forget. Your life changes, your expenses change, your employment situation changes. Revisiting it once a year, honestly, makes sure that the number stays relevant to your actual life and not to some version of your life that existed 3 years ago. The psychological side of emergency funds nobody talks about. I want to go somewhere a little different here for a moment because I think personal finance advice often treats money as a purely logical system and ignores the incredibly important psychological dimension of how we actually interact with it. Emergency funds aren't just financial instruments, they're emotional ones. Having one, a real one, not an undersized one, changes how you move through your financial life. It gives you the ability to make decisions from a place of choice rather than desperation, and the difference between those two things is enormous. When your financial cushion is thin, you make different decisions. You stay in jobs you should leave because you can't afford the gap. You don't negotiate as hard on salary because you need the offer to say yes. You don't take calculated risks, starting a side project, going back to school, making a career pivot, because the downside of failure is too scary. A well-funded emergency fund isn't just protection against the bad stuff, it's permission to pursue the good stuff. There's research in behavioral economics about what's called scarcity mindset, the idea that when people feel financially constrained, their cognitive bandwidth actually narrows. They become focused on the immediate, the short term, the crisis right in front of them. Long-term thinking becomes harder. That's not a character flaw, that's a documented psychological response to resource scarcity. An emergency fund is, in a very real sense, a way of buying yourself back your own thinking. When you're not worried about the floor falling out, you think better, you plan better, you make better decisions across every area of your financial life. That's worth something that doesn't show up in any calculation, but is absolutely real. What a truly modern emergency fund looks like in 2026. Let me try to bring this all together into something concrete and useful that you can actually take with you. A truly modern emergency fund in 2026 is not a fixed number based on a rule of thumb from a different era. It's a personalized, inflation-adjusted, risk-calibrated figure that reflects your actual life. Here's what that means in practice. For most traditionally employed people in stable industries, the floor is now 5 to 6 months, not 3. For people in volatile industries, specialized fields with longer hiring timelines, or anyone over 45 where the job market is less forgiving, push toward 8 to 10 months. For self-employed or freelance people, 9 to 12 months is the responsible minimum. It lives in a high-yield savings account, liquid, insured, earning something real while it waits. You've built in a buffer for emergency-adjacent costs, like insurance, job search expenses, and the premium you pay for convenience during stressful periods. And you revisit it annually to make sure the number reflects your current life, not a version of it from the past. That's it. It's not complicated, it's just more honest than the old version. Closing. There's a version of this video that ends with a big dramatic statement about how the economy is broken and everything is scary and you're all doomed unless you follow these specific steps. And honestly, I don't want to give you that video. What I actually believe, genuinely, is that a lot of people are doing their best with frameworks they were handed to them a long time ago and that haven't been updated to match reality. That's not a failure, that's just what happens when the world changes faster than the advice does. What you now know that you maybe didn't know at the start of this conversation is the 3 to 6 month rule needs to be updated for the current job market. Inflation has changed what your existing fund actually buys. Real emergencies cost more than your regular monthly expenses. Your employment risk might be higher than you're assuming. Where you keep your fund matters, and the right number is specific to your life, not a generic rule. None of this is meant to scare you. It's meant to give you an accurate map instead of an outdated one, because you can't navigate well with a map that doesn't match the terrain. If you've been sitting on a fund that felt like enough and this conversation has made you realize it might need to grow, that's not bad news. That's useful information. Information you can actually act on. Even if you can't do everything today, knowing the real target means every dollar you add from here is going somewhere meaningful. Start with the honest calculation. Figure out your actual number. Move it somewhere it earns something, and give yourself credit for taking this seriously, because most people don't. Most people glide past the uncomfortable parts of financial planning and stay with the version of reality that feels more comfortable. You're not doing that, and that's already the difference. Take care of yourselves out there. I'll see you in the next one.